It all started in a room filled with people who were supposed to be the smartest in their fields. The kind of people who had spent years studying, researching, and solving problems that most of the world couldn't even understand. The walls were lined with charts, diagrams, and equations that looked like a completely different language to anyone who wasn't an expert. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and there was a low hum of whispered conversations, interrupted every so often by the rustle of someone flipping a notebook page or tapping a keyboard. They were all gathered to work on something that had turned into a nightmare. Something that, no matter how many minds tried, no one had been able to solve. The problem was complicated in ways that made it almost impossible to describe. Everyone had their own theories, their own methods, and their own sets of calculations. And yet no one was getting anywhere. The experts had tried everything, every approach, every formula, every possible idea, but the result was always the same. Failure. Some of the people sitting in that room were quietly frustrated, some openly angry. A few rubbed their temples or paced back and forth, muttering under their breath. Others stared at their computers or whiteboards as if sheer willpower could make the solution appear. Every few minutes, someone would stand up and announce, "I think I've got it," only to return to their chair with a disappointed sigh when it became clear that their idea didn't work. The room had turned into a strange mix of tension, exhaustion, and quiet desperation. They were supposed to be the best, and yet they were stuck. The problem was one of those rare ones that didn't just test knowledge or skill. It tested creativity, patience, and the ability to think in ways no one had before. The more the experts tried, the more complicated it seemed. Solutions that looked promising at first would crumble under closer examination. No matter how much experience or training someone had, nothing worked. Outside the walls of that busy, tense room, the world didn't notice. It was just another day for most people. Streets were busy with people going to work or school, shops were opening, and life carried on as usual. No one could see the struggle happening inside that room. No one knew that some of the brightest minds were failing at something that was supposed to be solvable. Meanwhile, in a small, quiet neighborhood far away from that tense conference room, an 8-year-old child was spending the evening in a completely different kind of world. The room was cozy with soft lights, scattered toys, and piles of books and drawing paper. The child wasn't thinking about equations or theories. Instead, there were puzzles, games, and little experiments happening across the floor and desk. A jar of colored pencils, a stack of building blocks, and a few scattered toys made the space feel alive with creativity. This child loved figuring things out. Not the kind of things that required long study or degrees, but the kind of things that needed curiosity, imagination, and a willingness to try over and over again. If a puzzle was too tricky, the child would keep turning it around, examining it from every angle and trying different approaches until something clicked. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the joy was always in the process of figuring things out. One evening, while quietly doodling and working on a puzzle, the child overheard parents talking about the big problem the experts couldn't solve. The words floated across the room. "They've been trying for months and no one has found the solution. It's impossible." Curiosity immediately sparked. Impossible? That sounded like a challenge. And in the mind of an 8-year-old, impossible wasn't a reason to give up. Impossible was a reason to try. The child didn't understand the problem in all its technical complexity, of course. But that didn't matter. The idea of something being unsolvable by adults, people who were supposed to be the smartest in the world, felt like a puzzle waiting to be explored. The child sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide, thinking, "If they can't do it, maybe I can see it differently," the child thought. And with that, a plan began to form. Unlike the experts, who had been trapped in overthinking, the child had no training, no pressure, and no rules. The problem didn't have to be solved in any particular way. There were no deadlines or conferences to impress. It was just a puzzle, something to be explored and understood for the sheer joy of discovering a solution. And that freedom made all the difference. The child started by imagining the problem in simple terms, breaking it down into parts that made sense in everyday life. Instead of complicated formulas, the child thought in pictures, patterns, and stories. Instead of rules and instructions, there were connections, relationships, and possibilities. While the experts had spent months trying to force the solution, the child approached it like play. And in play, sometimes the most brilliant solutions are found. Hours passed like minutes. The child tried things, discarded them, and tried again. Some ideas seemed silly at first, but were tested anyway. The joy was in exploring the possibilities, in seeing patterns where no one else could. And slowly, quietly, something began to take shape. A simple, clever solution that didn't require all the years of study the experts had endured. It wasn't magic exactly, though it felt like it. It was imagination, curiosity, and determination working together. In the house, the world outside continued as usual. The child's family had no idea that something extraordinary was happening in their living room. Toys were scattered, snacks sat half-eaten, and the TV hummed in the background. To anyone looking in, it might have seemed like just another ordinary evening. But in that small corner of the world, a mind was quietly solving what everyone else had given up on. Meanwhile, back in the conference room, frustration had reached a new level. One of the experts slammed a hand on the table. "We've tried everything," someone exclaimed. "Nothing works." The team leader rubbed their forehead. They had thought they were ready for any challenge, but this one had pushed them to their limits. Meetings had run long into the night, calculations were repeated, experiments redone. And yet, the solution remained elusive. It was in this contrast, between the chaos of the expert's struggle and the quiet focus of a child's playful determination, that the story of this puzzle began to unfold. While the experts were weighed down by their knowledge, the child was lifted by curiosity. While the adults saw impossibility, the child saw a chance to explore. And in that simple approach, something remarkable was quietly forming. By the end of that evening, the child had a notebook filled with ideas, sketches, and observations. It wasn't neat or perfect. It wasn't technical or polished. But it had something far more important: understanding. A way of looking at the problem that no one else had considered. A solution in its simplest form was starting to emerge, and so, while the world outside went on without noticing, and while the experts inside the conference room prepared to resign themselves to failure for yet another day, a young mind had taken the first steps toward a breakthrough. Not with years of study, not with formulas and charts, but with curiosity, play, and a refusal to accept impossible as the answer. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. The beginning of a story where an 8-year-old would see what adults could not, where imagination would outshine experience, and where a solution that had eluded the brightest minds in the world would be found in the most unexpected place. And that night, the child went to bed with a quiet sense of excitement, unaware of how much the world was about to change simply because a mind refused to stop asking questions, refused to stop exploring, and refused to accept no as the final answer. The next morning, the child woke up with a sense of excitement that was hard to describe. It wasn't the usual excitement for cartoons or toys, but something different, something bigger. The puzzle that adults couldn't solve was still in the child's mind, buzzing quietly like a song that couldn't be ignored. With a cup of cocoa in hand, the child returned to the notebook from the night before. Flipping through the sketches, the ideas, and the little notes that had been scribbled in a rush of curiosity, the notebook looked messy to anyone else. There were lines crossing each other, arrows pointing in every direction, and random doodles of shapes and patterns. But to the child, it was perfect. Each mark, each scribble held meaning, and it all connected in a way that made sense. The first thing was to figure out which ideas were worth exploring further. Not everything made sense at first glance, but that was okay. Part of the process was testing things, making mistakes, and learning from them. The child set up a small workspace on the floor. Blocks were arranged, pencils were sharpened, and scraps of paper were ready to be turned into diagrams. Even though the problem was big and complicated, the approach was simple: start small, test ideas, and see what worked. This was something the experts often overlooked. They had been trying to force the perfect solution from the start, but the child knew that small steps often led to big discoveries. Time passed quickly. Hours slipped by unnoticed as the child worked. Sometimes the ideas seemed to fail, and a frown would appear, only to be replaced by determination a few minutes later. Each mistake wasn't a failure. It was just another clue. Every wrong attempt showed what didn't work and brought the child closer to what might. Slowly, the puzzle began to take shape. Patterns that had seemed invisible before started to appear. Connections began to emerge, and the solution, piece by piece, started to feel possible. What made this process different was how the child thought. While adults often relied on rules and past knowledge, the child relied on imagination. The mind jumped freely between ideas, connecting things that didn't seem related, looking at the problem from unusual angles and asking questions that no one else had asked. What if it's not like this? What if I try it the other way? These were questions the experts might have dismissed as too simple or even silly. But here they became the keys to discovery. By midday, the child was fully absorbed. Snacks were forgotten, toys were pushed aside, and the world outside seemed to disappear. There was only the puzzle, the notebook, and the joy of trying new ideas. Sometimes a solution seemed within reach, only to disappear when tested. Other times, a completely unexpected approach worked in a small way, giving hope that the larger problem could also be solved. The parents peeked in occasionally, curious about the focused silence coming from the room. They didn't interrupt because they had learned that when the child was in this state, nothing else mattered. Watching quietly from the doorway, they saw the small hands moving quickly, the eyes scanning, the mind clearly at work. There was a seriousness there that didn't belong to an ordinary 8-year-old. There was determination, curiosity, and a kind of intelligence that didn't need books or degrees to shine. As the afternoon sun streamed through the window, the child had an idea. What if the solution wasn't about complicated numbers or strict rules? What if it was about understanding the problem in a way that adults had missed because they were too focused on their methods? The child sketched diagrams that didn't look like anything the experts would have drawn, using colors, arrows, and shapes to represent thoughts instead of formulas. And for the first time, there was a sense of real progress. Something clicked. A tiny part of the solution was finally working in the notebook experiments. Excitement bubbled up, but the child stayed calm. There was no rush, no pressure, just curiosity and focus. Each successful step brought new ideas, and each mistake taught something valuable. By the evening, the room was covered in papers and sketches. Some pages were crumpled from failed attempts, while others held neat lines and patterns that hinted at the breakthrough the child had been chasing. Every mark, whether correct or not, had helped shape the understanding of the problem. The parents noticed the child was unusually quiet and focused, and they couldn't help but feel amazed. They had seen their child solve puzzles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a game or a school assignment. This was a problem that adults had called impossible, and yet here was a child working on it, quietly making sense of something the experts couldn't. There was something magical about it, though it wasn't magic. It was focus, curiosity, and a mind willing to explore without limits. Night came, but the child didn't stop immediately. The excitement was too strong, the curiosity too alive. Ideas kept coming, and each one was tested in the small workspace. Sometimes the solutions were simple, sometimes they were complicated, but each attempt, successful or not, added to the growing understanding of the puzzle. The child had a way of seeing things that adults often missed. The solution didn't have to be complicated to be correct. Sometimes, the simplest approach was the most powerful. The experts in their conference room were still struggling. They had spent weeks trying to solve the same problem, analyzing, arguing, and running experiments. Each day brought new frustration, and each failure made them more convinced that the problem was impossible. They didn't know that across town, a small mind was quietly finding patterns they couldn't see. They didn't know that hours of play and imagination were slowly turning into a solution. The contrast was striking. Adults with experience and degrees were trapped in the idea of what the solution should look like. They were overthinking, overcomplicating, and missing the simple truths hidden in plain sight. The child, on the other hand, didn't care what the solution was supposed to look like. The child just explored, tested, imagined, and followed curiosity wherever it led. And in that freedom, the first pieces of the answer were emerging. By the end of the night, the child leaned back, eyes tired but shining. The notebook was full, the blocks were scattered, and the room looked like a whirlwind of creativity. But there was satisfaction, too. Something real had been accomplished. A small breakthrough had been made, a part of the puzzle that had seemed impossible was now understood. And the child knew that this was only the beginning. What made this moment remarkable wasn't just that the child had found a step toward the solution. It was the way it had been done. No one had pressured the child. No one had said it couldn't be done. There were no rules, no limits, just curiosity, imagination, and persistence. And that combination, as the child had shown, could achieve what even the smartest adults could not. Finally, the child closed the notebook, stretched, and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new attempts, new ideas, and new experiments. The problem was not fully solved yet, but now it felt real. Now it felt like it could be solved. And most importantly, the child had learned something adults sometimes forgot. The joy of solving a problem is in the journey. In trying, failing, and trying again, not just in the final answer. With that thought, the child went to bed, notebook safely tucked away, mind buzzing with possibilities. Outside, the world was quiet, unaware that in a small room, a young mind had begun to crack a puzzle that had eluded the experts. The stage was set for something extraordinary. The next steps would be even more exciting, as the child would soon move from understanding small pieces to solving the entire problem, something that would leave everyone amazed. And as sleep finally took over, the child dreamed not of cartoons or toys, but of patterns, ideas, and connections. Dreaming of puzzles that could be solved with curiosity and imagination. Dreaming of the joy of discovery and of the day when even the experts would look at the solution in disbelief, wondering how an 8-year-old could have solved what they could not. The next morning, the child woke up early, full of energy and ideas. The previous night had been exciting, but the mind was still buzzing with questions. The small breakthrough from the day before had shown that solving the puzzle was possible, but now it was time to test the ideas more carefully. This part was tricky because it wasn't enough to just have a good idea. It had to actually work. The workspace was ready. Blocks and papers were scattered across the floor, pencils were sharpened, and the notebook was open to the page that held the first promising solution. Unlike before, the child felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was no longer just playing with ideas. It was about testing them to see if they really made sense. Each step would need patience and careful observation. The child started slowly, repeating the small steps that had worked before. Each move was measured, each observation recorded in the notebook. The lines and arrows that had seemed random the night before were starting to form a pattern. Something was beginning to make sense. A connection was becoming clear, and the child's excitement grew with each new discovery. Sometimes the ideas didn't work. A block would fall, a pencil sketch didn't make sense, or a pattern that looked correct turned out to be wrong. Each time, the child paused, thought about what went wrong, and tried again in a slightly different way. There was no frustration that lasted long. Mistakes were just part of the process. Every failure taught something new, something important about the problem. By midday, the child had tested several variations. Some of them failed completely, others worked only partially, but one idea stood out. It was simple, clear, and elegant. The child could see why it worked, how it connected all the pieces, and what made it different from the attempts that had failed. The sense of understanding was thrilling. It was the feeling of finally seeing the path where none had existed before. The parents, noticing the intense focus, watched quietly from a distance. They didn't want to interrupt because they knew the child was in a state of deep concentration. There was something magical about the way the child approached the problem. No one had told the child what to do, no one had guided the process, and yet, there was a logic and clarity that was remarkable. It wasn't just intelligence, it was curiosity, imagination, and persistence combined in a way that made anything seem possible. The child continued to refine the approach, testing it over and over. Each test made the understanding stronger. Little adjustments were made, small improvements that seemed insignificant at first but added up to something impressive. It was like building a tower with tiny blocks. One small block might not matter, but together, they created something solid and beautiful. By the afternoon, the solution was beginning to feel real. The child could see how all the pieces fit together. The notebook was now full of detailed diagrams, notes, and observations. It was messy, yes, but it told the story of discovery, trial, and learning. Every page showed a part of the journey. Every mark was a step closer to the final answer. What made this process extraordinary was how the child saw connections that adults had missed. While experts had been stuck thinking about rules and formulas, the child noticed patterns and possibilities that didn't require complicated calculations. It wasn't about knowing more. It was about seeing differently. And seeing differently, the child realized, could solve what no one else could. As evening approached, the child decided it was time to try something bigger. It wasn't enough to understand small pieces anymore. Now it was time to put everything together, to see if the solution worked as a whole. This was risky because it might fail completely, but the child was ready. Failure didn't feel scary. It felt like part of the adventure. The child cleared a bigger space on the floor and began arranging the materials carefully. Notes were reviewed, blocks repositioned, and sketches checked. Everything needed to be in the right place. The first attempt was cautious, slow, and deliberate. Each move was considered, each step observed. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Then slowly, the pieces began to align. It was a small moment, but it felt enormous. The child could see how the earlier failures had led to this point, how every wrong idea had taught something new, how the understanding had grown gradually, steadily, like water filling a glass drop by drop. And now the glass was nearly full. The solution, in its first full form, was almost complete. There was a quiet confidence building. The child smiled, knowing that something extraordinary was happening. It wasn't just that a puzzle was being solved. It was that the approach was unique, creative, and powerful. This was proof that intelligence wasn't only about years of study. Sometimes it was about curiosity, imagination, and the willingness to see differently. The parents couldn't help but step in quietly, curious about what had captured the child's attention so fully. They watched as the child tested the solution again and again, adjusting small details, observing results, and refining the approach. There was focus, determination, and a joy that was impossible to miss. It was inspiring to see a mind at work in this way, solving something that adults had called impossible. As night approached, the child realized that the solution was not just possible but complete. Every piece fit together, every observation made sense, and the puzzle that had seemed insurmountable was now understood. The joy of discovery was overwhelming. It wasn't just about being right. It was about the journey, about trying, failing, learning, and finally succeeding. The parents were amazed. They had never seen anything like it. The child had taken something that adults had failed to solve and approached it with simplicity, creativity, and determination. No lectures, no guidance, no pressure, just curiosity, imagination, and persistence. And it had worked. The child had solved it, but the real test was still ahead. It wasn't enough to solve it at home. The experts, with all their knowledge and experience, still hadn't found the answer. Could the child's solution really stand up to their scrutiny? Could it really be as brilliant as it seemed? The thought was thrilling and a little nerve-wracking, but the child was ready. Before going to bed, the child reviewed the notebook one last time, checking every step, every note, every observation. Confidence was high, but humility was there too. This wasn't about showing off or proving anyone wrong. It was about solving a puzzle, about understanding something that had seemed impossible. And in that moment, the child felt proud, excited, and ready for whatever came next. As sleep approached, the mind kept spinning. Ideas, patterns, and connections floated through dreams. The child imagined showing the solution to the world, imagining the looks on the experts' faces when they realized that an 8-year-old had solved what they could not. There was no arrogance, only excitement and curiosity. This was the moment the child had been waiting for, and it felt incredible. The world outside didn't notice anything special. Streets were busy, lights twinkled in buildings, and life went on as usual. But in that small room, something extraordinary had happened. A young mind had not only discovered a solution, but had also learned the power of curiosity, persistence, and creative thinking. The stage was set for the next day, when the solution would be tested in the real world, and when the child's discovery would move from the notebook to something much bigger. And as the night deepened, the child slept, dreaming of puzzles, patterns, and possibilities, dreaming of the moment when imagination would meet reality, and when adults would see what a fresh perspective could accomplish. The journey was far from over, but the hardest part, the understanding, was now complete. And that understanding, born of curiosity and determination, would soon change everything. The next morning, the child woke up feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. After days of thinking, testing, and refining, the solution was ready. It was no longer just an idea in a notebook. It was a real, working solution that could solve the puzzle the experts had been struggling with for months. The child packed the notebook carefully, made sure all sketches and notes were in order, and felt a flutter of anticipation. Today was the day to show the work to the world, or at least to the people who had been unable to solve it themselves. Meanwhile, in the conference room far across town, the experts were at it again. They had been called in for another session, trying yet another approach to the problem that had stumped them. The air was tense, filled with frustration and exhaustion. Several had been working on this for weeks, and each failure had chipped away at their confidence. Some were whispering doubts to each other, while others stared blankly at their notes, hoping for a breakthrough that never came. When the child arrived, carrying the small notebook and a simple setup of sketches and models, there was a mixture of surprise and curiosity. An 8-year-old had come to the experts' conference room. Some smiled politely, assuming it was a fun demonstration, while others raised eyebrows, unsure what a child could possibly contribute to a problem that had baffled brilliant minds. The child's calm confidence, however, caught their attention. There was no boastfulness, no arrogance, only quiet determination and curiosity shining in the eyes. The child set the notebook and the small models on a table and began explaining the approach. The language was simple, clear, and easy to understand. There were no complicated formulas, no jargon, no heavy equations. Instead, the child used sketches, patterns, and step-by-step reasoning that everyone could follow. At first, some experts exchanged skeptical glances. They were used to complexity, not simplicity. Could this possibly work? The child began demonstrating small parts of the solution. Every step was logical, every observation explained in plain words. The child encouraged the experts to test it themselves, to see how each piece connected and why it worked. Slowly, doubt began to fade and curiosity grew. The experts leaned in, following the instructions carefully, trying to understand how something so simple could actually solve the problem that had seemed impossible. As the demonstration continued, the experts started to notice the brilliance of the approach. What the child had done was not a trick or guesswork. It was a different way of seeing the problem. While the experts had been focused on complicated methods, the child had looked at it simply, broken it down into understandable parts, and connected pieces in a way no one else had thought of. There was elegance in the solution, a clarity that was almost magical. One by one, the experts tried their own experiments using the child's method. To their astonishment, it worked. Every part of the solution made sense and held up under testing. The puzzle that had seemed impossible for months was now being solved step by step. Some experts shook their heads in disbelief. How could a child, with no formal training and no experience in this field, solve something that had defeated the best minds? Others smiled, quietly impressed. Realizing that the simplicity of the approach was its genius, the child explained patiently, answering questions with clarity and thoughtfulness. When asked why it worked, the child pointed to the patterns, the observations, and the small steps that built the solution. There was no complicated theory, only logic, curiosity, and careful reasoning. The experts began to appreciate something they had overlooked. Sometimes understanding comes not from knowledge, but from a fresh perspective. As the demonstration continued, the room was filled with a sense of awe. What had seemed impossible was now clear. The child's solution worked not just in theory, but in practice. Every experiment confirmed it. What had been months of struggle for the experts was solved in a way they had never imagined. There was silence at first, then murmurs of amazement, and finally applause, not for a show, but for the clarity and brilliance of an 8-year-old's thinking. Some experts, humbled, admitted that they had been trapped by their own experience. They had overcomplicated the problem, thinking that the solution must be as complex as the challenge itself. The child, however, saw the problem with fresh eyes, unburdened by rules or expectations. This allowed a simple yet powerful solution to emerge, showing that curiosity and imagination could sometimes surpass years of expertise. The child's parents watched from the side, quietly amazed. They had always known their child was curious and intelligent, but seeing the solution unfold in front of experts was extraordinary. They saw the respect forming in the room, the astonishment, and the realization that their child's approach had achieved what others could not. It was a moment of pride, not just for the child, but for the power of curiosity and determination. As the session continued, the experts discussed the implications of the solution. They realized that the child's method could be applied in other areas as well. The simplicity and clarity were not limited to this problem. It could inspire new ways of thinking, new approaches to challenges that had seemed unsolvable. The child had not only solved the immediate puzzle, but had opened a door to fresh thinking and creativity in the field. Some of the experts asked the child to explain the thought process in more detail. The child described how observation, experimentation, and breaking the problem into smaller pieces had helped find the solution. Every step was grounded in logic, yet presented in a way that was intuitive and easy to understand. There were no shortcuts, no luck, only careful thinking and persistence. The experts began to nod in agreement, seeing the depth of the child's understanding. By the end of the session, the room was transformed. What had started as skepticism and doubt turned into admiration and respect. The child's solution was validated, tested, and accepted. The experts, who had once been frustrated and exhausted, were now amazed and inspired. They realized that intelligence was not just about knowledge or experience, it was also about perspective, creativity, and the courage to explore ideas that others might overlook. The child packed up the notebook and materials, quietly satisfied. There was no need for praise or recognition. The joy came from solving the puzzle and seeing it work. The child had proven something important, that even the most difficult challenges could be solved when approached with curiosity, imagination, and persistence. Adults with years of experience could learn from a fresh perspective, and sometimes the simplest solutions were the most powerful. As the experts left the room, many stopped to thank the child personally. There were handshakes, smiles, and words of admiration. Some admitted that they had been wrong to doubt, that they had underestimated what could be achieved with a simple, creative approach. The child listened quietly, appreciating the respect but focusing more on the journey of discovery than on recognition. After the session, the child returned home, still thinking about the day. The puzzle had been solved, but the excitement wasn't over. There were more questions to explore, more ideas to test, and more puzzles waiting to be solved. The child understood that the journey of discovery never really ends. Each solution opens the door to new challenges and new opportunities to think differently. That evening, the parents asked about the day. The child smiled, explaining the experiments, the reactions of the experts, and the way the solution had worked. They spoke not with pride, but with excitement for learning and exploration. It was clear that the child's mind was still full of curiosity, ready to tackle whatever came next. Undeterred by the limits that adults often set for themselves, the story of that day would soon spread, though not immediately. People would talk about how an 8-year-old had solved a problem that had stumped experts. But for the child, it was never about fame or recognition. It was about curiosity, learning, and the joy of discovery. The lesson was simple. Sometimes the most powerful ideas come from looking at things in a new way, asking questions that others overlook, and having the courage to explore what seems impossible. As the night fell, the child went to bed, notebook closed, mind calm but still buzzing with ideas. The solution had worked, the experts had been amazed, and the impossible had been made possible. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a moment that showed the world that age, experience, or status didn't define the ability to solve problems. Curiosity, persistence, and imagination did, and as sleep took over, the child dreamed not of recognition or applause, but of puzzles waiting to be solved, of ideas waiting to be explored, and of the joy that comes from discovering something that others couldn't see. The day had been extraordinary, but it was only part of a journey that would continue, driven by curiosity, creativity, and a refusal to accept impossible as the final answer.